Okay, hello everyone, welcome back to class. Today we're going to be talking about neoclassical architecture and what classicism looks like in architecture in the 20th century. This technically will be our last history lecture. The next month, the next couple of classes will be talking about design. You know, what does classical design look like? What is Baroque? I'm sorry, what does Beaux-Arts architecture look like in terms of design? So we're going to be learning a lot of different design terminology, but today we're going to be looking at really kind of the end of classical architecture and how it merges with the 20th century. Of course, I think some of these images I've shown you before in class. Neoclassical, of course, is a revival of classical architecture. It's a new classicism. Of course, we're leaving the Baroque era. You remember the Baroque architecture where it's very sinewy and there's a lot of ellipses and curves and multiple geometries. So we're kind of leaving that era and going back to something a little bit more orthogonal and rectilinear. So we're looking at roughly, the end of the Baroque era, roughly the 1650s, 1700s to the early 20th centuries. If you remember, of course, neoclassical architecture is a new classicism, which means that they bring the early classical motifs and ideas from ancient classical architecture, roughly 500 BC, which of course were really built for large temples for gods. Now we're building classical architecture for large urban environments and of course for people. So we're going to be looking at neoclassical architecture and new classicism, building scale really for urban environments. We're going to be looking at the industrial age. What did iron, steel, and concrete do to architecture and space roughly in the 1850s? These are just a few list of architects we're going to be looking at. These are some really wonderful power players in neoclassical architecture. We've seen Edwin Lutyens, John Soane, of course, Christopher Wren. We're going to be looking at American classical architecture, Louis Sullivan, and of course, one of my favorites, McKim White. I've shown you these before in class probably several months ago, but of course, we're going back to, the early classical style. This, of course, it could have been in an ancient Greek style. We're looking at Greek Doric, Ionic capitals. And of course, the structure of it is a very simple Greek sort of temple front without the pediment. Then, of course, the plans are not Baroque at all. We're going back to an orthogonal plan, of course, with one figural space, the round dome. I think I've shown these to you before, but Belay was a neoclassical architect, French, and probably did a lot of imaginary architecture. None of these things were really actually built. You can see that very emphatically neoclassical. You can imagine this as an enormous temple for the gods in ancient Greece or Rome, roughly 500 or 300 BC. So we're going back and carefully displaying the classical orders in the 1700s. The same thing with this one. He's kind of experimenting the ultimate size that classical architecture could lend itself, because we're not building with steel, concrete, we're still using stone and masonry. So really, neoclassical architecture, I like to think the origins are roughly fluctuate between Paris and London. The early the 1700s. We've seen some of these projects before. We've seen ClaudeLedoux's work, French neoclassical. The austerity is really powerful because we're not covering everything with all the classical orders. So we're actually showing the pure form with, of course, the arches from ancient Rome and, of course, the Greek temple front from ancient Greece. Let's roughly look at neoclassical Paris. We have Paris has its own Pantheon, of course, a large dome. This is the architect Soufflot, and are probably pronounced Soufflot. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but in 1790, we can clearly see that it's neoclassical because we're borrowing the cylindrical dome and, of course, the drum and, of course, the dome from ancient Rome, of course, with a Greek pediment on the front. So clearly, you can definitely see that we're going back to the ancient classical styles of Greece and Rome. This is just a magnificent interior with predominantly the Corinthian order. You can see the saucer-shaped domes, of course, the coffers, really borrowed from the ancient Pantheon in Rome, roughly the 1st century AD. Now, these are just a few examples. I think I've shown these in class before, but, Jean-Jacques Gabriel was really responsible for really introducing, for the majority, neoclassical architecture in Paris. Here's a little side. It's called the Petit Trianon in Paris, actually outside in Versailles, we see a small little, elegant little temple front there with, of course, a Corinthian order. Of course, he did much larger projects, the entire design of Place de la Concorde, which of course has a Greek temple front with rows of Corinthian columns defining the large outdoor space. Here's a detail of the facade. Clearly, we see the classical orders reinstated here again. Now, these are just a few projects in Paris because I think I've shown you a lot of work from Paris and Italy. We're going to move into America pretty soon, but this is one architect I really haven't mentioned. John Soane was only one of the most brilliant neoclassical architects. What's interesting about his work is because he's hinting at something relatively modern. His own house, his own studio, this is where he taught classes, had his own practice, but he combined several different London flats. The center part is the white cut stone is actually the addition, or the actually remodel the central part of this townhouse, this row of townhouses in his own studio and classrooms. What we're looking at is not Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. We're looking at a very simplified, elegant, sort of stripped down version of classical architecture. We're not seeing the columnar orders. We're seeing just the pure form. But look at the way the windows are very carefully cut out of the stone. You know, we're not looking at heavy door surrounds, window surrounds. We're not looking at the really heavy Renaissance or classical orders. He actually is very original at creating his own sort of language and architecture. When we look at Louis Sullivan and early Wright's work, we see in a very original imagination at work here, because we've seen thousands of years of the classical orders being reinterpreted and reinstated in many of these really, of course, extraordinary buildings. Now remember, you know, we're not using concrete or steel, we're still using masonry, dome, and of course, and mortar, and some iron. So here's a wonderful interior, a very original, of course, still a classical language because we're seeing the consecutive arches, but we're not seeing the columnar orders reinstated again and again. He has a very original language. He's what's considered an early modernist because we're leaving out a lot of the decorative orders. If you remember, the main difference between Greek and Roman architecture is of course because the Greek structure and columns, those are actually structural. In Roman architecture, like the columns on the Colosseum, those are decorative. So he has his own sort of early language of what, you know, neoclassical architecture could be. It's very interesting, complex spatial dynamics. Most architects would divide these spaces with large columns, but Soane is freeing up and still defining the rectilinear rooms with these layers in the ceiling, not with rows of columns and, of course, Doric and Corinthian. Here is his Bank of England. This is a reconstruction drawing. Most of this, of course, is a huge plan of this, mostly a large series of rotundas and courtyards. This building actually doesn't really exist, only in parts of it, but this was an incredible, this was the main Bank of England. But we're seeing, is of course, an incredibly elaborate large plan of pochette. The walls are carved out of the solid mass. We see a lot of axial conditions. When we talk about classical design, we're going to be learning some terminology about the way the spaces are related to an axis, so on and so forth. But the interior is really original and unique because, of course, he could have covered the columns, the structural bays and the spatial definition with the columnar orders, but he has his own very simplified, elegant way of articulating space with just these really kind of soaring curvilinear elements. Now we've looked at St. Paul's, Christopher Wren in London, his main cathedral there. Of course, he's still building in a very heavy neoclassical style. We're looking at Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, but it's only one of the largest churches in the world. I've shown this to you before. I'm just going to kind of quickly look over some of his other work. And he pretty much was responsible for building the city of London after the Great Fire in 1666. He pretty much rebuilt a lot of the churches. So a lot of the spires and steeples are, if you look at the old city of London, that are based off of Wren's churches. So Wren and Soane were really responsible for introducing really what's called neoclassical architecture in the city of London. And these are just absolutely magnificent buildings. Now, this is just a fraction of their work, so we have quite a bit of information and other architects to look at. I was going to bring to the forefront, this is another wonderful English architect practicing in the countryside, and of course the city of London, Sir Edwin Lutyens. I've shown a few of his projects, but he was pretty much really a very original neoclassical architect. A lot of historians would consider him to be purely classical, but of course he does fit into the neoclassical sort of industrial age, just in terms of the time frame, 1869 to 1944. This is really the same time that Frank Lloyd Wright was born in practice, roughly during the time Louis Sullivan, the modern architect, was working in Chicago. What's interesting is Lutyens had a very striking, unbelievable, original classical language. What he did was he didn't just copy the classical orders, he really sort of broke the rules beautifully. We're going to see some examples in a minute. What I'm going to show you is this is an extraordinary painting of pretty much one artist did this incredible panorama of pretty much all of his projects in one scene. We're looking at his extraordinary country houses at the foreground. The middle ground is probably considered in the world of architecture the greatest unbuilt building that ever was, the enormous Liverpool Cathedral. Of course, in the background, we're seeing his New Delhi Capitol buildings, which is just really extraordinary, a very stylized, but of course, with Indian motifs, beautifully conglomerated or inspired or mixed together with classical architecture. Of course, we've seen his really wonderful country house, really designed to look undesigned. They're not really following any sort of formal classical language. Of course, this is, 1899, where we've already seen the formal neoclassical language already established by Sir John Soane and Christopher Wren. So what we're going to show you is some more of the details of this extraordinary cathedral that I'm not sure, I think it's some of the foundations were started, but I'm assuming in terms of funding and progress that we're not able to finish the rest of the building. But of course, parts of it exist mostly in models and of course in foundations. This is just an extraordinary mixture of classical themes, very original. What Lutyens does with what's called massing is the way the blocks group together to form an entire whole. Little parts are very, very carefully articulated. The planar elements, the pure planar elements, the facade, are very, very carefully articulated with just a few openings. Again, he's not showing all the classical orders in a horizontal register like a lot of the other neoclassical architects done. It's strange that a lot of architects at the time really didn't appreciate Lutyens' work because he was not doing modern. By 1899, we had steel and of course concrete, but he loved, English countryside architecture and classical architecture. He was probably one of the best brilliant architects to really pull off the classical language and sort of break the rules. What we're seeing in this particular image is, of course, clearly the explicit classical language. We're seeing the Diocletian window established, the ancient Roman baths, which you saw earlier. But we're looking at the little side windows are called edicules or ridiculous, the little portals that frame the windows. Now notice that the entire facade is not completely overdone and decorated with the classical orders. We are seeing a very judicious application of where the classical orders are applied onto the wall. And of course, the way the dome transfers down into these enormous massive walls, there's just a few little openings. Here's a plan of some of the sections of the front nave and of course the front loggia. Of course, we're still building in a very heavy masonry classical language. I'm sure he probably incorporated steel and iron into this, but it's still not truly, even though we are using steel and iron, it's still not truly a modern building because we're still building with load-bearing masonry and of course walls. Extraordinary plan of what's called poche. It looks like all the little chapels, the little side halls are carved out of a solid mass. It's almost like somebody took a large block of stone or wood and took a jigsaw or chisel and just carved the spaces out. When you look at a city of the Noli map of Rome, you're gonna be able to see that a lot of those spaces look like they've just been carved out of a mass. But it's also interesting what Lutyens does with the main facade. There's the entire facade, the front part is like a large triumphal arch. Of course, the central entry is underneath the main circular opening. It's really, kind of a playful language of what's called inversions. If you look at some of Michelangelo's work in the Renaissance, particularly the Capitoline Hill, he kind of flipped things around and puts things upside down. Normally in classical architecture, you would never see a curve upside down like this, but he was so brilliant at sort of breaking the rules that we see an upside down curve beautifully displayed and articulated on the wall. It's interesting what he does with the square columns. They're not just really independent columns away from the wall, they're actually integrated into the coursing into the wall. A very original, playful language. And a lot of people don't really give his work credit because he was technically doing classical architecture in modern, but he was so extraordinary. I mean, look at these projects. I mean, only, Wright, Sullivan, or Corbusier would have, a complete body of works of this magnitude. And his just a look at his working drawings are just wonderful to even see. This is a section of some of the chimneys in his early country houses. And this is some of his later work. He did the entire city, the Capitol buildings for New Delhi. A very interesting mixture of Islamic or Indian themes mixed with classical motifs. Of course, it's classical because we do see the large colonnade, the loggia, of course, with the arched niches carved into the wall, and of course, the continuous coursing. But look at the way he does facades. They're not just glass windows everywhere. It's interesting that this building has a certain amount of porosity. The facade exists just to define the courtyard space. There's not necessarily program in every square inch of this, but it's interesting that we can see the trees beyond the windows there. But we're looking at the very exaggerated sort of cantilever for the shelf. Normally, classical architects, neoclassical, would have done a large kind of hugely proportioned cornice. But what's interesting, what Lutyens does with the Indian motif, he does a large cantilevered shelf for the corner, a very modern, sort of very stylized cornice motif. What's interesting is that at this time, Frank Lloyd Wright was hugely popular and recently published his Wasmuth portfolio, of course, the German publication for all of Wright's work. What's interesting is I like to sort of share the story that Edwin Lutyens, when designing a lot of his project, he was looking at Frank Lloyd Wright's plans and his work, and he was always kind of looking at his work, Frank Lloyd Wright's work in the drawings, and sort of not really imitating, but he was always kind of inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright's sort of very modernistic sensibilities. It's interesting, he would never admit that he's borrowing Frank Lloyd Wright's aesthetic, but we can clearly see that the two together are sort of referencing each other, just really by the fact that that cornice comes into a very knife edge, which you see a lot of early Frank Lloyd Wright's drawings and his early projects have that very, very exaggerated horizontal cornice. Of course, Lutyens is an ultimate classical architect. But let's take a look at what Lutyens does with the classical orders, a very playful, sort of original sort of capital language. Now, we've seen some very interesting Baroque capitals. We've seen Borromini and Bernini's really kind of playful sort of language in classical orders. This is an architect that took the classical formula and changed it, broke the rules, and did something really wonderful. I'm sure the bell-shaped forms are probably hints to early Indian cultures, but he's able to sort of, stylize this in a very playful language. Of course, the architectural frieze is curved and of course what's called pulvinated. And it's interesting what he does with the columns on the right. So he's very carefully using the original proportions of the classical language, sort of breaking out of sort of the boundaries of the classical, the formula of classical architecture. Kind of the same thing with what John Soane does. And I think, a lot of designers that are doing classical architecture now, maybe, if they don't really realize that, classical architecture can be classical without just, explicitly showing the classical orders in a very literal sense. I just find John Soane's work and Lutyens very sort of early modern and somewhat original compared to the contemporaries in the time frame. Here's some of Lutyens' other pavilions. It's really wonderful what Lutyens does with the facade. There's not just holes and openings everywhere. The wall facade is celebrated and really appreciated as these really low relief profiles. There's only select parts where the edicula or the little columns occur on the wall. Really wonderful. Of course, the scale of the arched opening is really phenomenal, especially if you look at the scale of the entry portal into the Liverpool Cathedral. I think this is he did a series of mausoleums, but this is just look at the way the pedimented architrave, the negative space has been carved out. Like it's almost like the little pediment is an object in the space. Normally, he takes one motif and repeats it smaller as the very capital of the tower. Really, very extraordinary and original work. It's interesting. He does some very literal things. The flag poles are actually carved out of the fabric is actually carved out of stone, which is really intriguing. These are some of his other projects he did in London. The Midland Bank, a really wonderful classical language series of arts without just literally adorning everything with the classical orders. So now we're going to shift over to neoclassical architecture in America. I'm sure you've probably seen or heard of this in any of your history classes in college or high school. I'm going to talk about some of our early transitions from classical architecture into early modernism. We're not really going to talk about modernism, but what happened to architecture, structure, and space during the turn of the century. We're going to kind of visit Chicago, the burning city. Louis Sullivan really was the architect hired to rebuild Chicago after the huge fire in the late 1800s. Of course, he is considered the father of the modern skyscraper. Of course, it is modern, not because of the aesthetic sensibilities, but of course, is that we're using steel. And by the 1850s, we have a concrete frame reinforced with steel. Very original. It's interesting that, you know, when the ancient city of Rome was sacked in 500, 400, or 500 AD, is that the formula for concrete was lost. So between 500 AD and 1850, we're still building with brick masonry and parts of it with iron. We're not really able to build a very tall building until we get to Louis Sullivan. And of course, some of his other contemporaries are mixing steel to build a very tall building. But let's take a look, before I talk about the skyscrapers, let's take a look at Louis Sullivan's classical language. Let's look at what he does with the columnar capital. Very ornate and overdone, and he's not, of course, literally borrowing the styles of classical ancient Greece. He sort of developed his own original style. And of course, there's another one of his extraordinary capitals. It's interesting, he develops the repetitive horizontal line, which is this sort of precursor, what's called modern architectural detail, the repetitive horizontal. We're still looking at the classical volutes, but they're adorned with literal leaf forms, not acanthus leaves like the ones on the ancient Corinthian capital in ancient Greece, but his own original language. And these are just extraordinary pieces of craft, sculpture, and architecture in terracotta. Let's take a look at what Louis Sullivan does with the classical language and with the early skyscraper. I mean, early skyscraper. Isn't his skyscrapers like a variation of the columnar capital itself? We see a base, a shaft, a capital, beautifully articulated, very ornately carved. You know, because, you know, we're not really ready to show a purely steel building because functionally and aesthetically, we're not able to show the pure steel modern skyscraper because we don't have the physical capacity to build a glass box with steel. We're only able to do that with Mies van der Rohe's, you know, early modern architecture roughly in the 1940s. But what we're looking at is Louis Sullivan's really beautiful genius in incorporating a modern architecture with classical sensibilities. So let's take a look at his work in the Chicago World's Fair. His work really stood out among the other classical and Baroque architecture at the time. This is what's called the Golden Gate there, built in the Chicago's World Fair. A very interesting mixture of many different motifs, Islamic motifs, mixed with a very original architectural language that Louis Sullivan created. Here are the buildings around the typical Baroque and neoclassical architecture in the setting of Louis Sullivan's architecture there on the site. we can see that his work stood out among the neoclassical and Baroque architecture. Now, the city of Chicago wanted to see a new modern city. They were not going to go back to the early classical styles which they've seen before. So the reason that Louis Sullivan was hired to rebuild the city is because his work was so original and somewhat futuristic for the late 1800s, the early turn of the century. So when we look at Louis Sullivan's work, it's really because his architecture stood out among what I'm considering. What I've read is that the typical neoclassical and Baroque architecture during the time frame. So the city of Chicago wanted a new original language of architecture, and we definitely got it with Louis Sullivan's work. Of course, we're still seeing classical arches. It's not truly modern, but it's a very original motif. So when we talk about skyscraper, we're looking at roughly the tall buildings between the Victorian age, the late 1800s, and of course, Louis Sullivan's early skyscrapers. Now, when we carefully, I'm sorry, can you still see the full screen?
Yes, you can.
Okay, good. So we're looking at the transition of, typical American Victorian architecture. We look at the tower on the left, the one in the middle, and of course, Louis Sullivan's taller buildings on the right. We're building with heavy masonry blocks in Victorian. Then we're seeing cast iron and masonry in 1890. I think that is a building in San Francisco. Then, of course, we're seeing steel in Louis Sullivan's time frame, 1897. But before we get to this point, let's look at Louis Sullivan's early classical language before we did the tall buildings. This auditorium building in 1889, this is really heavy Romanesque architecture. Now, remember, we looked at Romanesque architecture early in some of the last lectures, is that it's almost like architecture in its very bare bones structural capacity. We're not adorning this with all the classical orders. What we're looking at is what's called a rusticated base. The rustications are the sort of rough chiseled out blocks. They look like somebody just found the blocks in a field and of course constructed the facade with very heavy, intimidating architecture for the base. Then gradually we get to something lighter, more delicate at the top. So of course there's Louis Sullivan on the right, always with the full beard and a nice little dapper hat. What we look at is the facades above that have a very more delicate classical language. But again, we're not completely covering the entire facade with the classical language. We're seeing the pure arches that have looked like they've been chiseled out or cut out of a large block of stone. And a very simplified cornice, a little bit kind of an antithesis to ancient classical architecture proportions and the proper size for the cornice. But he's kind of going for something a little bit simpler in terms of the classical language in this one. Here's the main facade. We see the base, the heavy base, the Romanesque arches, the shaft, and of course the capital with a very delicate cornice. But let's look what Louis Sullivan does with the classical language at the tower. This is the large tower for the Auditorium building. We're seeing one of our very few horizontal registers on a facade. Normally the tower would emphasize the vertical, but now Louis Sullivan does a very horizontal register with the rows of columns at the top. It's almost like we've taken the loggia from the ground floor, inverted it, and put it at the very top of the building. A very original and sort of playful way to deal with a colonnade on the ground floor. He sort of interprets that and puts it on the very top of the building. Very unusual and very original for the top of a tower in architecture. Here's incredible cross section showing the auditorium sanctuary just carved out of this incredible solid block. Of course, not really carved out. It looks like that. There's a wooden frame around that, but the section is wonderfully pochade out of that solid block. Of course, here is, I like to show the scale of some of Louis Sullivan's motifs. These enormous plant-like forms which are adorned in a lot of the cornices of the friezes at the top of some of the buildings. So there's probably a detail of something like this. Okay, so let's look at how some of these tall buildings were made. This is Chicago in, 1885, 1899. You can imagine driving through the city or walking, or driving in a mule-drawn carriage or horse and carriage. I mean, this is unprecedented level of construction architecture. It must have been mind-blowing to see something like this. We had never really seen anything in architecture quite like this. But to see a tall steel skyscraper in an American city or any city in this time frame must have been absolutely Just really wonderful and kind of scary to even look at. Of course, we're looking at the masonry is really not the structure of the building, it's a really decorative skin. So what Lewis Sullivan does with his architectural language, we really see an original of course, the original parts of what's called the horizontal window. We really haven't seen a large horizontal window in architecture. We've seen, of course, horizontal windows in classical architecture using the base and, of course, the foundation, the attic windows. But for the most part, the main facade had vertical windows, of course, which emphasized the vertical for the tower. So pretty much classical architecture really does not use a horizontal window. Really strange and original that the proportion of the window is strictly modern just by the virtue of the horizontal. Of course, it's called the Chicago window because now we're able to make a large plane of glass without mullions in it. Of course, the side windows are the double hung windows that let ventilation in. Now with electricity, look what we can do with architecture during the modern era. Very exciting and electrifying to even see that. So Louis Sullivan does a very kind of 180 degree with the classical language and architecture. It is not really purely modern. It's not really purely classical. It's a mixture of in between. Now, again, this is terracotta. Some of it is stone. This is terracotta tile. It's more efficient to build with terracotta tile more than stone because, we're not using terracotta tile in ancient Greece or the Renaissance. The terracotta tile for construction method is a symbol of efficiency. You don't have to have thousands of sculptors on scaffolding or in warehouse carving each one of these out. You have one mold that can be repeated again and again and again. So the terracotta tile in the mold is sort of born out of necessity and function and efficiency. So we're just going to quickly look at some of Wright's early work and his collaboration with Sullivan. There's only one project, really, the Sharnley House. This is before Wright was doing, purely modernistic architecture without curves or any sort of columnar orders. What's interesting is I like to show people the transition from classical, neoclassical to early modern. Normally we would have done a beautiful row of columnar orders with probably Doric and Corinthian, but it is modern because the verticality is expressed with just these really thin little wooden struts or slats for the screen between the staircase opening and, of course, the other parts. What's really wonderful is to look at the language of the classical order done in a sort of early modern tradition. You can see the loggia that normally is on the ground floor is superimposed onto the top as a balcony. Of course, you see Louis Sullivan's extraordinary hand and decoration ornament. What's interesting is look at the classical language that they do in early modern architecture with the fireplace. The fireplace is not just an object placed onto a wall with an enormous sort of adorned mantle. It is incorporated into the composition as a very disciplined register of horizontals, and it is flanked by these enormous arches. It is not really an object on the field, it's actually incorporated into the composition. It's almost like they're trying to disguise the square fireplace in the wainscoting in the wall. Very original and very intriguing to do with classical architecture. Here, of course, is a photograph about the trees. We can see the massing. The openings look like they've been cut out with a large axe. There is really not that much ornamentation over all the openings. So some other buildings we've seen early in the class, we've seen this extraordinary McKimmey White building, the municipal building. Of course, I'm sure that McKimmey White and Louis Sullivan saw each other's work, and we're still looking at what I like to show is American neoclassical architecture in a larger sense, because these are classical architecture built for large urban environments. The proportions are completely different than a small country house or, of course, the ancient temples in ancient Greece and Rome. We're still seeing it is modern because we're using a steel and concrete frame. Of course, it's adorned with stone and masonry. Of course, this is cut stone applied onto the steel skeletal frame. What we're looking at is a classical language because we're still seeing the base, the shaft, and the capital beautifully articulated. These are just extraordinary buildings. Now, this is just one of the buildings that McKimmey White did. I would like to show you some buildings around my own environments. I live in downtown Dallas. I see extraordinary buildings all the time in my neighborhood. I'm showing you because These are wonderful examples of neoclassical architecture just in my neighborhood. I have, close proximity and foot access, so I'm always walking around and photographing. These are just really unbelievable buildings. This is the famous, well, in my neighborhood, very well known, the Magnolia Building, built in 1921 by a British architect, Alfred Bosson. And we can see clearly the beautiful classical language. Now, this is really architecture before they had a lot of power tools. So this is all these details are really carved by hand and chisels. I give walking tours. I love to show people the details for this to be hand carved. Of course, it is clearly based on ancient Roman architecture because we're seeing the recessed coffers in the stonework. Of course, there is surprisingly a steel frame and a concrete frame behind these. These are really neoclassical architecture in the 1920s. And American architecture was very popular in the 1920s with neoclassical architecture. These are just really powerful, they look like they've been built by gods, not people. Again, this is early Dallas in 1905, 1911. Very unprecedented landscape of steel. Of course, we're seeing on the right the Adolphus Hotel with the brick and masonry going as a cladding around that. It's a wonderful neoclassical facade. The Auditorium building built in 1905. This is Dallas's tallest building in 1905. What's interesting, what we see with classical architecture roughly in the 20th century is we see the Holocaust of architecture in the 50s and 60s. When you look at the building on the right, it's the same building. What they're doing is there's a trend to get away from classicism and classical styles in the 50s and 60s. So what they did was they didn't just cover up the classical details, they removed them. You can see my cursor on the right. We're looking at the outriggers to support the cornice, which was removed. A very disturbing sort of imagery that we're streamlining the buildings just as a way of making everything modern. So they didn't cover them up, they just removed all the class for aluminum frame on a steel box. It's really just kind of a shame. That was part of history. It's important to know that. These are some other extraordinary buildings. These are some buildings that were demolished supposedly for parking lots in 1980. For someone to take a bulldozer to something like this, this was roughly built in 1915. The columnar detail is, of course, a very Louis Sullivan-esque sensibility in ornamentation and decoration. But for someone to tear something like this down for a parking lot is absolutely criminal to do this. And these are just some extraordinary examples of early classical art. We see the enormously proportioned cornice, proportions not for the size of the building, but of course for the scale of the city and of course the enormous tower that we have. The little building on the left is what the topology of the street architecture used to look like before we had steel and concrete. So everything got much larger, the spaces became larger, the buildings became taller because now we have steel and elevators. This is, I'm sure you've heard of the famous Adolphus Hotel. This is a construction photo in 1911. This is great. I mean, we're seeing the formulation of the steel and of course the masonry and terracotta top being applied onto the facade. This is a great picture. This is, of course, the tower element called the cupola on top of this, one of these buildings in downtown. This, of course, is now called the Drakestone Building. What happened was, you can see the Tempietto or the cupola. The cupola is a very common lantern or tower on top of the great classical domes you see in Rome and, of course, around Italy. But there is a steel frame behind this. What happened was, there's a flagpole that was installed in the 1940s, and of course, it wasn't flashed properly. So over about 30 years of weather and deterioration, the dome started to deteriorate. So they rebuilt the entire dome as a steel frame. What's really wonderful is they built the entire steel frame as one unit on the street and then hoisted it up 500 feet in the air with this crane. It was absolutely wonderful to see the classical language of architecture being lifted up by modern cranes. And so they rebuilt the entire thing and they clad this with, they carefully reconstructed the classical orders with some of the formulas I've shown you in class early before, but we still have the re-emergence of the classical tower completely rebuilt. This is a great building. This is called the famous Wilson Building in 1903. But I love to show construction photographs. Look at this. This is what the building looks like now. This is the same wall under construction. It's really wonderful that we actually put the Ionic classical orders on first, and then we started building the ribs and of course the stone, of course, consecutively built on one layer after another. But this is cast iron with stone and masonry. This is just an extraordinary picture to show that. And then we have, of course, the front facade, this extraordinary classical arch. The size of that curved pediment is enormous. It's not proportioned for the doorway, it's proportioned for the entire building. Here is one of the corner details, just extraordinary work. This is a mixture of clay tile, masonry, and of course, it's cut stone. The last part of the lecture is we have, I think, about 15 minutes. I think I've shown this to you before. I'm just going to end the lecture with continuing traditional classical architecture. It's really wonderful to see that, people, these are really famous, well-known architects in the world of classical architecture. They spent the time and dedication to carefully reconstruct, what the proper proportion and scale of classical architecture is as an art form, not just a quick construction method to apply the walls with decorative columns. These are very, very carefully done. We're lucky to have these people. These are 20th century classical architecture. We've looked at these before, Alan Greenberg, Quinlan Terry, but they've spent their lifetime dedicating and studying the proper proportion, how to properly design a column, a wall, a window opening. These are not just somebody that, picks something out of a catalog and applies it onto a wall. These are very, very carefully done. And the walls in classical architecture are so wonderfully three-dimensional. We can see the proper thickness of the columns, how properly inset the windows are in a classical wall. We've seen Robert Stern, his houses, kind of loosely based off of early American architecture, becoming white. Then we've seen what he's doing with the tall building in modern times in classical architecture. I'm not doing his work justice, but we can see that he's very carefully honoring the proper scale and of course the classical proportion. He does really these wonderful little contradictions that normally you would have columns at the corner of this little resort in Seaside, but he does something really playful with that one singular column at the septum is all the structure that you need. Of course, the roof is flying above it because we can still do that because we're using steel and iron with this. We've seen Robert Stern's wonderful The Barron Estate in Dallas, of course, a very beautiful, carefully proportioned language. Of course, we see the famous Quinlan Terry, which is very dedicated at properly building and designing in the true classical language. Here's some of Quinlan Terry's. I've shown you these before. I'm just kind of quickly refreshing your memory of how beautiful some of these really neoclassical architectural constructions are in urban environments. As this sort of his hand at Baroque architecture, mostly, the very carefully proportioned Greek temple front. We're still seeing a very masterful drawings. A lot of these classical architects are great because they could draw beautifully, because drawing is a very important integral part in designing architecture. I think I've shown you these. I like to show the unbuilt projects, just the vast scale and proportion of the power of neoclassical architecture. I'm sure these are probably not built because of probably cost provisions, but these were just enormous imaginary spaces that could have been built but weren't. I've shown these to you before. This is some of Ledoux's work, the very severe Gothic temple front. Clearly it's Doric because we see the triglyphs, the menhir, carefully expressed. I'd like to show this one. I just happened to stumble upon, I think this is a building in Washington, D.C. I'm sorry, I don't know the architect's name, but look what the modern additions beautifully incorporate the existing classical walls. Normally we would just remove those or maybe just cover those up, but it's really wonderful to see that the classical language is treated as these pieces of artwork in a museum. I'm not sure what building this one is. Here's the outdoor shell of it, but we can still see the classical language still beautifully sort of honored in sort of the modern enclosure of that glass and aluminum frame. Well, it is, we have about 10 more minutes. I'm happy to answer some questions. I can flip through some of the slides.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
Are we gonna get, this was great, and I would love to see your PDF, like a PDF or the PowerPoint
Yes.
afterwards. If
Okay.
okay, great. And then
Yes.
do we get, did you, I think you had said you would send the other ones from the previous sessions, previous classes. I don't
Yes.
think I've seen those in my email. I don't know, maybe
Okay. Yeah. At the end of each month, I combine all the PDFs.
okay.
And we have a question and answer form that you fill out. So you will get the PDFs, and I'll get with Michelle and Valerie to see when we can actually get that together. But you will have all the PowerPoints together. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Any questions or comments or?
Oh, I have a observation.
Yes.
The slide that's up right now reminded me of it.
Oh,
Because
yeah.
I remember we went inside, and isn't this a house that has that dining room that has the lantern in the inside, and then there's space around it?
Yes, the breakfast room. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
and isn't a couple of weeks ago you showed slides of Hadrian's villa?
Yes.
Isn't that the same sort of shape where it's and the floor rotated and things like that?
Yeah, the rotating dining room. Yeah, it's a little bit similar to that. I mean, of course, John Soane's it's called a breakfast room,
Yeah.
but his breakfast room, the floor doesn't rotate, but it is a cylindrical saucer-shaped dome. Yeah, I think, I think when all these great architects visited Pompeii and ancient Rome and Hadrian's Villa, they were all heavily inspired by a lot of the sort of experimental structures there. So I'm sure the round breakfast room that Johnstone design was probably based off of Domus Aurea because it does have those little light shafts coming in between. I don't have a slide of that, but I wish I did. But yeah, I think it's very correlated to that.
Well, thanks for the introduction to both. It was a
Sure.
great confirmation that
Oh, good. Yeah, I mean, I love to, I wish I had more time to show more of Johnstone's work. He was so brilliant and original. And of course, we could spend an entire semester looking at Lutyens' extraordinary work, but there's only about an hour to show everything. But I just thought this was absolutely magnificent, these walls. Of course, the building itself too.
and I like how you brought up the New Delhi Capitol building,
Oh,
and
those are so, yeah.
yeah, and the suggestion. What I thought of was, oh, well, that part of India is as flat as the Midwest, so you might say it's
Mhm.
a perfect extension of the prairies style,
Oh,
because
that's interesting. Yeah.
just the landscape begat the prairie
Right.
school, and then you have this you know
Yeah.
similar thing.
Yeah. I like to show people that, I mean, the classical language doesn't have to fit into a formula with a base shaft and a properly proportioned corners. We've seen other architects make liberties and variations, but I show the best people that sort of break the mold and do it beautifully. I mean, this person is an absolute genius at form, space, and articulation. Of course he was, yeah. Especially as imaginative as the mausoleum buildings, those are really original. But then, of course, if you look at these freestanding pediments, if you look at some reconstruction drawings of Hadrian's Villa, Apollodorus, the architect, does something similar to this. So I think, I think these architects looked at reconstruction renderings and are kind of inspired by, Apollodorus's playful language of classical architecture.
And then also, do you know what year if I'm remembering correctly, Otis Elevator was a Chicago company.
I don't,
And-
but I'm assuming it's the late 1800s, probably because we didn't really, because they were, well, this building is 1896. The first steel and concrete frame was really 1850. I'm sure by the 1850s they would have had to have elevators because, I mean, it would be such a struggle to get to the top floor if you're working in an office.
Yeah, because from what I understand, the tolerance level is like 6 or 7 floors, and
Mhm.
so
Without
when
an elevator.
yeah, so when Haussmann was doing, you know, Paris, it was like, oh,
Mhm.
that's as far as people are going to want to walk, you know?
Right.
And it sort of inverts. It's like the least desirable flats are on the top floor because you have to walk up so high.
Right. Yeah.
Whereas now the penthouse is considered desirable.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, because of the view. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's sort of inverted value.
Right. Okay. Yeah. It would be really difficult to occupy this building without elevators. Of course it would. Yeah. Okay, we have 3 more minutes. Any other comments or questions or?
I think that maybe there's no comments or questions in the chat.
Okay, great. Okay, well, so class again, next week we're going to be talking about specific design elements. And so you probably would want to bring your sketchbooks. I'm not requiring drawings, but it would be good to just have a sketchbook in hand. So we're going to start talking about Beaux-Arts design sensibilities next Tuesday morning or afternoon. Okay, thank you, Michelle, and thanks everyone for attending today.
Thank you, guys.